Tonight, we won't chase kings or count dynasties. Instead, we'll drift beside a river that remembers everything it's touched. The water moves like thought slow, deliberate, full of secrets that refuse to dry. Lamps lean over black water. Papyrus rustles like distant reeds. Somewhere between those sounds, a chest floats wood dark with age, sealed not by locks, but by story. They say a god once lay inside it, not as thunder, but as curved. The Nile carried him the way a mother carries news, softly and to everyone at once. Each bend became a shrine, each sandbank a verse. And when the chest finally disappeared beyond sight, the river did what all good witnesses do. It began to tell the tale again, one ripple at a time. So lower the lights. Let the hush of the oars fold around you. And if your breathing begins to follow the rhythm of the river's quiet argument with the shore, that's just Egypt remembering itself. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next tide will remember you there. And somewhere between your breath and the rivers, a lamp flickers. Its glow trembles on black water, tracing thin gold lines that wander but never break. The oars rest, as if listening for permission. In that stillness, the story begins to surface, not shouted but carried, the way silk carries memory. A chest drifts by, quiet as a thought that's decided to stay unspoken. It will move with the current until myth and geography trade names, until every ripple learns to spell the word beginning. In these quiet retellings, the chest is not a crime scene, but a floating address label. Where it rests, builders will someday say, yes, this is a good place for a shrine, and also for a small snack stall nearby. The wood swells, the gilding dulls, barnacles compose their tiny biographies on the underside, and the river begins its long and careful job of turning one unfortunate incident into curriculum. At each remembered murring, later generations will add a doorway, an incense niche, a courtyard tree that throws just enough shade. The myth suggests very politely that geography needs stories to feel finished, and that Osiris, even dismembered, was still extremely good organization. If you're still awake at this point, you can, if you like, follow along every future episode of this journey. Or, if your eyes are already heavier than a granite lintel, you can delegate the task to the priest, and I will simply murmur the rest for you. When Seth's sharp idea arrives, the tale in this soft version does not linger on impact. Instead, it becomes a filing system. Each piece of the king goes ashore in a different district, not with chaos, but with the resigned precision of someone sorting legal documents into labeled baskets. A head here, a rib there, a spine politely delivered elsewhere, each fragment an excuse for a new cult place, each cult place an excuse for another feast day, another bakery, another batch of carefully accounted temple beer. Scribes, who understand the importance of a good index, approve of this, though they do not say it aloud. They draw up lists, head north, heart, somewhere dignified. Other parts, distributed like sacred punctuation marks along the Nile's margin. The body in this muted telling is more blueprint than tragedy. One god's inconvenience becomes everyone's itinerary. And so the kingdom acquires a series of gently competing addresses, all claiming to keep a portion of Osiris safe, rather like a nation of people insisting that the best cup of tea is definitely brewed in their neighborhood and providing inscriptions to prove it. Isis enters the story softly, walking the riverbank with the unhurried pace of someone who has accepted that this will be a long project with many receipts. She is widow, sister, surveyor, and night shift cartographer, pausing wherever the moon makes a brighter path on the water. At each stop, she listens. People tell her, in careful low voices, that something of Osiris was felt there once. A dream, a breeze, a strangely dignified log. They point to small hills, to notches in the bank, explaining that of course this is where an important limb must have come ashore. Look at the way the reeds lean. Isis, being patient and very experienced with symbolic thinking, allows each claim to settle like silt. She lights a lamp, or in some traditions just stands very still until starlight does the work, and quietly assigns a name, an epithet of Osiris, a local quality of the soil, a hopeful adjective. In doing so, she begins to string the country together, bead by bead, noting that a river with stations is easier to remember than a river that is only wet. By dawn in these stories, nothing dramatic has changed, and that is the point. A new town has a new title, the place where his beautiful something rests, which is both very specific and somehow conveniently vague. The priest there will repeat it for centuries, pleased. Isis moves on. She gathers what she can, not in panic, but with the methodical habit of someone who has done a lot of temple administration. Bandaging is described as craft, not emergency. Herbs are applied with the same seriousness as you might apply labels to archival boxes. Where pieces are missing or doubled, myth supplies elegant footnotes instead of panic. In one quiet courtyard, people will swear they have the genuine head. In another, people will also swear they have the genuine head. And both will be correct in that accommodating way religious geography has of letting multiple truths sip the same libation. As these resting places multiply, cities begin to listen to the story with interest. A fragment of Osiris, even a hypothetical one, is an excellent reason to request extra offerings and a small statue subsidy. Abydos, Osiris, Mendes, and others put forward their candidacies with dignified persistence. Their steely rave like polite advertisements. Here he rests most peacefully, here his memory is sharpest. Here the barley grows tall, because he is especially content under this particular patch of earth. Pilgrims, who are not in a hurry and enjoy options, stroll from one claim to another, collecting blessings like stamps on a slow-moving passport. Some towns specialize. One will be the place of his backbone, suitable for strengthening your career spine. Another site of his heart, recommended for matters of love or complex paperwork that needs compassion. In this gentle competition, there is no angry divine audit, only an unspoken agreement that honoring Osiris anywhere helps keep the whole land stitched. Double burials appear, cenotaphs raised for a king whose actual remains were already quite distributed. Pharaohs build empty tombs at Abydos, so they can be noticed worshipping near Osiris without the logistical challenge of relocating their bodies later. The idea of presence becomes beautifully elastic. A stone sarcophagus can hold air and still count. A chapel with no occupant can still be full if the stories are thick enough. The land fills with these echoing spaces, like multiple open browser tabs of holiness, each quietly updating the sense that the king is present in many places at once. Nothing about it is urgent. It is simply administratively thorough. Priests, ever fond of documentation, turn festivals into subtle map reviews. Processions follow routes that trace Osiris' remembered journey, standard bearers walking like mobile pens on a sacred atlas. Boats cross the Nile not only to reach the other side, but to rehearse the mythic crossing of limbs and titles, each oarstroke a small annotation. Hymns list place names in loving, exhaustive order, as if the gods enjoy hearing the country read aloud like a bedtime story. Abydos foremost of the Westerners, Osiris noble in the marshes, Mendes fragrant with incense, and on, until even the most wakeful listener begins to feel pleasantly drowsy. Calendars fix certain days for visiting certain shrines, effectively turning the year into a slow tour of the map. Geography, in this way, hides inside liturgy, so that farmers, scribes, and officials absorb it without ever sitting through a formal lecture. Some thinkers, both ancient and the sort who keep you company late at night, now like to imagine that if you could see Egypt from Ra's solar bark at midday, the shrines of Osiris would shine up in a pattern, each one a luminous dot where a story anchored itself. The pattern would look a bit like a body lying along the river's green spine, not anatomically strict. but recognizably whole if you are in a generous mood, and myth always assumes you are. The head towards the delta, contemplating the sea. The feet somewhere in the south, soaked in cataract spray. The heart and temples that never quite agree which of them it is. From above, Ra might nod, pleased that mortality has produced such neat diagramming. The boat crew, who have heard every version of every story, probably place bets quiet. Devotional ones on which town has provided the most convincing hymn this season, though of course the official line is that all are correct and the system is working perfectly. At ground level, though, among people with lamps and sandals and errands, the effect is gentler. Knowing that Osiris has a stake everywhere makes travel emotionally padded. A trader sleeping in a fairy's hold can think, if he wishes, that the god is stored safely nearby in at least 3 directions. A woman pouring water at dawn can assume the Nile carries not only silt from upstream, but reassurance. From a king who once knew how to fall apart gracefully, the myth folds into small gestures. A scrap of green faience shaped like the jet pillar slipped into a child's. Amulet string, a wall painting where part of the borders just place names marching tidily around, like a comforting to-do list already done. You do not have to believe each claim with forensic certainty. You only have to accept that the country has agreed, collectively, to remember itself through him. By the time the story circles back to us in this room, with its quiet glow and its almost still air, the dismemberment has become the least interesting part. What remains is the map. Osiris has a soft grid under every step, his myth teaching directions more kindly than any stern official. To walk south is to move along his spine. To pause at Abydos is to lean near his most prestigious address. To watch the Delta Fork is to stand somewhere near the region that likes to apply for the roll of his head. It is all gently excessive, like having 8 different favorite pillows and deciding they all count as the real one. Scholars will, and did, debate the sequence and the authenticity, but under the stars, the farmers and children mostly just liked knowing that nowhere was entirely without a piece of the king. So we drift, as the tale does, along this imagined body of the land. The lamp in your mind's small temple stays low but steady. Outside, the Nile moves with the same indifferent attention it has always had, carrying fragments of many things, none of them in a hurry. We have followed the chess, noted the pieces, watched Isis walk and name, listened to towns make their shy, insistent claims, and seen priests turn memory into an atlas that fits in a human voice. There is no final verdict to deliver, no last revelation to sit up for. Only the sense that Egypt, in telling this story softly, wrapped itself in a blanket of shrines so that people could sleep feeling the country was held together, even if kings and listeners were sometimes not. And as the last names of the last sanctuaries blur at the edges of thought, the narrative keeps flowing on, very quietly, past where you need to follow it, like the river itself slipping through the dark, one long-remembered body, whole enough for tonight. You might not expect the fate of the world to hinge on the color of beer, but in Egypt, even catastrophe liked to arrive with a very specific shade chart. In the quiet version of this story, before anyone gets nervous, we begin not with roaring or fire, but with a city that is slightly too warm and a lion-headed goddess who has perhaps had a long week. Lamps lean against mud brick walls, doing their best. The air above Memphis holds the thin, humming stillness of a place where people are pretending nothing is wrong while carefully not looking up at the sky. Sekhmet is abroad in names more than noise, the one before, whom evil trembles the lady of arrows, the eye of Re, and her titles whispered in doorways sound like the labels on very sharp tools, stored on very high shelves. People close shutters a bit earlier, sweep thresholds twice, offer an extra cup of beer to the household gods, just in case. Mothers listen to the night and water jars. Fathers listen to their own pulse like a drum, and everyone quietly agrees that the best strategy is to move slowly, speak politely, and not attract the attention of anyone. whose crown includes a sun disk and the general concept of plague. Ra, in these softer tellings, has made a decision in the manner of a very old manager who overestimates how loudly he needs to send an email. There has been talk of humanity misbehaving, of conspiracies and ingratitude, of complaints transmitted upriver like memos. Sekhmet is sent out to address the situation. The details of what she does are usually told with a great deal of red paint and alarm, but tonight we glide past that part as if the papyrus scroll has a gentle smudge. What matters here is that, at some point, Ra looks down at this experiment in strictness and feels that perhaps it is spiraling into more paperwork than expected. The goddess has taken her role seriously, very seriously. The Nile breeze tastes metallic. Temples consider updating their insurance policies. And into this alarmingly efficient attempt at justice tiptoe the lesser gods and clever priests with a proposal that sounds, at first like a recipe and second like an apology. They do not shout to Sekhmet to stop. That would be risky and, more importantly, ineffective. Instead, they discuss color options. The plan arrives in murmurs. If the Eye of Ra is hunting anything that looks like blood, perhaps the world can offer her something red and harmless until her anger lies down to nap. Barley is summoned, not in panicked heaps, but in measured baskets checked twice, the way scribes check columns of numbers. Brewmasters, who take pride in their work and prefer their myths to mention them by name, begin an overnight shift. Barley beer bubbles in great vats, breathing out a comforting smell of toasted grain and small talk. Into it, powdered red ochre is sifted like patient sunset dust. Lotus petals and hints of poppy whisper in at the edges of the brew, not loudly enough to violate any health regulations, but enough to encourage drowsiness in beings even slightly inclined toward it. A scribe with a clean brush records ratios with austere concentration, so many jars of beer to so many measures of pigment, a kindness translated into numbers. The mixture must resemble blood but not behave like it. This is an important creative constraint. The jar lids settle with soft clicks, like decisions finalized in a meeting where everyone nods a little too vigorously. Before dawn, the jars are carried out, not with fanfare, but with the chain of slow footsteps that always precedes a festival or a well-organized breakfast. The basins are poured discreetly over a chosen floodplain, seeping into the earth until a stretch of the land glows red in the first gray light. No trumpets. No speeches. Just an expanse of shimmering, impossible sweetness pretending to be horror. The city darkens its windows so that from above, the only invitation Sekhmet will see is this red mirror waiting for her. It is misdirection as hospitality, a quiet buffet set for a terrifying guest in the hope that she will overeat and oversleep. Sekhmet arrives when the sky is still the color of unbaked clay. She sees the flooded plain, the sheet of red, and in this telling she does not roar. She simply pauses, like a cat considering new furniture. It pleases her. It looks like success. She steps into the pool and drinks. The liquid is cool and deep, heavy with grain and pigment and suggestion. It tastes not of fear, but of carefully curated comfort, and although this is not what she expects, Divine Pride has no objection to refreshments provided in her honor. So she drinks again and again. The storytellers, thoroughly aware that their audience is keeping one eye open, assure us that there is a great deal of beer. One tradition says 7,000 jars, which is less a precise figure and more a polite way of saying we absolutely over-catered just to be safe. As she drinks, something shifts. The ferocity in her gaze softens, not theatrically, but in tiny increments, as if each mouthful quietly replaces one sharp thought with a slower one. The sun climbs a little. The priests hiding behind rocks try not to cough. Sekhmet's steps, still powerful, leave less decisive marks. She surveys a world now tinted rose and finds it satisfactory, then slightly amusing, then slightly blurry. Her mind eases from hunt to feast, from feast to drowse. Eventually, as all cats, lion-headed or otherwise, are cosmically required to do, she circles once or twice and lies down. Some versions say the fierce eye of Ra becomes Hathor in that moment, radiant and gentle. Some say she merely relaxes the angle of her ears. For our sleepy purposes, it is enough to know that the wrath that would not stop has been persuaded, via color theory and craft brewing, to take a nap. In the morning light, villagers open their doors onto a landscape painted in faded pinks, the puddles drying into chalky memory. They move carefully, giving the goddess's resting place a wide, respectful berth, as one does when a large relative is finally asleep on the couch. Ra's officials perform a subtle audit of survival and decide the cure has worked sufficiently. The plan has been a triumph of quiet logistics, no speeches, no duels, just a supply chain of barley, pigment, and soft deception. If you are still awake at this point, you might admire the ingenuity. When dealing with divine anger, someone essentially invented calming beverages and mood lighting. If you are drifting, that is fine. The red pools are already sinking into earth. The sharp edges of the story are sinking too. Later, of course, humans will want to understand what exactly happened, and understanding in Egypt usually involves several temples, a list of ingredients, and occasional census data. So the scene shifts from the river plain to the writing tables. Scribes bend over a straka and papyrus to note down how mercy was brewed. The recipe is never given in full, alarming detail. Parts are murmured as temple secrets, parts as practical advice. Here is how you mix barley beer strong enough to sway a goddess. Here is how you grind ochre until it dissolves, so the color is smooth, so no one can taste the trick. Here are suitable times of year close to festivals of Hathor, perhaps when joy and sleep are ritually appropriate. It reads like a cookbook footnoted with theology. There is no sense of panic left, only the pleasant fussiness of people who know that the future may ask, exactly how red was it? The myth begins to ripple into small habits. Brewers offering beer to Hathor and Sekhmet give it a particular sheen and smile at the way it catches the light. Artists painting temple walls lean into rich, deep reds knowingly. Physicians, always on the lookout for precedents, remember that when rage threatened the world, the solution involved dilution, coolness, and rest, plus a judicious amount of plant-based additives. They fold this into their house call advice. Drink, lie down, gaze at something soothing. Please stop cursing the neighbors. The connection is never shouted, but it hums underneath 1,000 minor rituals. In medical papyri, red ink is reserved for important headings and divine names. A tiny echo of the night when red signaled not danger, but the carefully measured end of it. Back at the mythic scene, our perspective tightens once more on the goddess herself. As the beer does its work, she is described as seeing her reflection in the red pools. The face looking back is hers and also strangely softened, features blurred by ripples, like a version of herself drawn with kinder lines. Some versions say she laughs. Some say she is simply entranced, as anyone might be while watching light move across water when they are pleasantly overfed and slightly dizzy. That reflection is a quiet hinge in the tale. The moment the eye of Ra sees that she can be both power and pleasure, both lioness and lady of music and dance. The transition is not a dramatic costume change. It is more like realizing you can schedule days off without resigning. Festivals grow out of this, as they tend to do. Every year, people gather with flowers and sistrums and jugs of beer, telling each other with straight faces that they are reenacting a vital cosmic safety measure, while clearly also enjoying an excuse to sing. They drink in moderation, ideally, learning from the myth that one should stop well before one's destructive side needs to be tricked to bed. The line between sacred and social is pleasantly thin. Base, the dwarf god with the grinning, protective face, turns up on cosmetic pots and bed legs. making sure that whatever echoes of Sekhmet's ferocity remain are filtered through jokes and lullabies before they approach the household. And then, as always happens in these divine case studies, someone needs to write a report. Priests compile hymns that subtly remind Sekhmet of her gentler outcomes, a kind of divine performance review emphasizing growth areas like accepts offerings of music and chooses to protect. Medical temples keep small archives of red ink spells for fevers and bites, invoking her not as attacker, but as the one who knows how to turn heat into healing. Somewhere in a cool chamber, a wall scene shows rows of jars, each beautifully labeled, as if the storage of possible cures is itself a kind of worship. Archivists with excellent penmanship preserve the memory of this nocturnal negotiation so that future generations, should any god or human forget themselves, will have a precedent to wave politely in the air. What remains for us, listening in the half-dark, is a remarkably soothing impression. The world nearly ended, perhaps, but in this retelling it didn't, because someone understood that even a goddess has a threshold where exhaustion and a good drink can turn wrath into sleep. Punishment became palate. A rampage became a recipe used once and then folded away like a well-worn cloth. The sharpest danger dissolved into festivals of laughter and late harvest beers served in little cups, painted inside with tiny images so that as you finish, a friendly face smiles up at you. It is hard to stay anxious in a cosmos where the apocalypse can be postponed by creative catering and an early bedtime. So the story drifts on in low tones, a lioness in the dawn fields breathing evenly, villagers resuming their chores with the unspoken agreement that no one mention how close things came, scribes capping their ink satisfied that somewhere in their shelves the formulas for sleep and mercy sit side by side. The red that once meant terror now stains only jars, lips, and festival ribbons. Above, Ra continues his predictable commute across the sky, perhaps a little relieved, perhaps making a note to choose his words more mildly next time. And if on some particularly hot night the wind feels a little wild and you think of Sekhmet's first steps, you can also remember that somewhere there is a story patiently brewing, ready to pour itself out in soft colors until teeth turn to yawns and roaring turns inevitably into the steady harmless rhythm of a goddess breathing in her sleep while the world, reassured by the sheer practicality of it all, slips quietly into its own. You might not expect a missing body to double as a national map, but Egypt has always been efficient with symbolism. In Osiris, poor patient Osiris is asked to multitask even after death. Imagine the river at night, dark and slow, carrying rumor more than water. Somewhere upstream, a cedar chest drifts, very dignified in its carpentry, very undignified in its contents. It is said that when the lid closed, the Nile changed tone, as if the country had received an urgent sealed letter and was pretending not to read it yet. In the soft telling, there is no shouting banquet, no dramatic revelation. There's just a long wooden box being guided along the current like an absent-minded barge, brushing against reeds, nudging past sleepy fishing boats, occasionally alarming a Huron. The first people who see it do not open it. They are Egyptian and understand that anything that well made is probably already spoken for by a god or a tax office. But the sight settles into memory. There, at that bend of the river, something important passed by. A shrine could go there one day. A story could moor there. It is how the chest begins, unintentionally, to draw lines along the water. The chest grounds itself eventually, as all furniture does. Some say it reaches the papyrus thickets of Byblos. Some say only a distant marsh, but in each version the place becomes a pin stuck into the mental map of the faithful. The priests add a quiet note, here the body rested, write it down. You can almost see them already planning annual processions with sensible sandals. When Seth moves beyond simple confinement and rearranges the king into several unfortunate pieces, it is done in this version with the fussy precision of someone labeling files. Head here, arm there, trunk elsewhere, as if Egypt were being given a very literal distributed system. The result is macabre, yes, but also unexpectedly practical. Suddenly, there are many potential holy places, each with a claim to part of the story, like towns realizing they all own at least one page of a famous poet's notebook. Each fragment's resting place is a coordinate remembered in liturgy. If you lay the later temples over a map of the Nile, they say, you can trace his outline from delta to cataract. It is an unsettling way to think about geography. It is also deeply organized. Isis steps into this scattered arrangement like a curator, determined to find every missing piece in a museum that has mislaid its index. She walks by night because the air is cooler, the roads are emptier, and one does not search for sacred limbs in the full glare of gossip. Her lanterns float along the embankments, little pockets of gold measuring out the dark. At each village she pauses, listening to how the local dogs bark, how the wind moves through sycamores, reading the land as if Osiris could be overheard in the crook of a branch. Where the river makes a slow curve, she gives that bend a name that tastes like ribs. Where reeds grow unusually tall, she marks it as a place a thigh might have passed. People watch from porches, wondering about the veiled woman tracing invisible lines in the air. They will learn later they were present at the first draft of a sacred atlas. By dawn, she has moved on, but the marks remain. Shrines are small at first: a stone, a pot of cool water, a loaf of yesterday's bread. Farmers fold in these offerings with the same practical hands that tie their sandals. If a goddess has wept here, then the field will be gentle with them. If she has found a fragment of her husband here, then perhaps the grain will stand straighter. Isis collects parts as she goes, not frantically but methodically. Each recovery is wrapped in linen with the care of a skilled archivist labeling a shelf. When she can, she tucks them together, bone to bone, place to place, until the broken story approximates a body again. The myth usually hurries here, but tonight we let it idle. Picture her sorting, measuring, stitching with spells that sound like softly repeated addresses. Every bandage is basically a line saying, you belong here, and you belong here, and I'm not forgetting any of you. Word spreads, of course, that somewhere along the river a complete Osiris, or close enough for ritual work, has been assembled. Cities perk up. Being connected to the king who mastered death is excellent for tourism and afterlife prospects. Temples begin to mention, with carefully casual pride, that they possess a particularly important relic. One city hints that they have his heart, which is a sought-after relic in any religious economy. Another insists they hold an essential vertebra, which they assure you is symbolically very significant if you think about stability. At Abydos, the claim grows confident. Here is the truest resting place. The chapel of choice, the place where the bark will certainly stop and check its oars. Gnomes downriver murmur that this is all very nice, but if one looks at the angle of their own sanctuaries, clearly some vital sinew must once have drawn taut here. Competition remains polite, as it must in a universe where the gods are listening. No one says the others are wrong. They merely emphasize that their piece is perhaps more central, more official, or more metaphysically connected. Double burials appear like footnotes. A king might build his real tomb in one desert valley and a symbolic one at Abydos, the better to affiliate himself with Osiris' reconstructed story. It is a bit like having both a primary residence and a mailing address of prestige. Stone coffins contain not only bodies but clever positioning. Traveling through Egypt, a careful listener could piece together the consensus. Osiris is everywhere. His limbs, once scattered maliciously, are now scattered devoutly, each part guarded by priests whose daily schedule includes lighting lamps, sweeping thresholds, and reassuring pilgrims that yes, they have come to the right place. This spread of claims and chapels creates, unintentionally but irresistibly, a map no one ever draws on papyrus. Festival calendars list journeys, upriver to the sanctuary in month X. Downriver to that one in month, Y boats follow these routes so faithfully that over time the wakes might as well be ink. Songs name cities in sequences that mimic the mythic reconstruction, moving from wound to healing, from separation to stitching. When the Nile floods, its water touches many of these shrines in turn, as if renewing the connections between vertebrae, ribs, and heart. Scribes, naturally, begin to notice. They are the sort of people who enjoy patterns. In their ledgers and hymns, they align things quietly. The place where Osiris' head was said to lie receives festivals of vision and insight. The place of his backbone celebrates stability. Somewhere there is a marsh known fondly as where a leg once considered resting. Administration joins in with no fuss at all. Boundaries between gnomes echo sacred lines. Tax lists are organized in the same sequence as processions. If this sounds suspiciously convenient, that is because it is. In a kingdom as long and thin as Egypt, any excuse to tie the farthest village to a familiar god is helpful. The myth offers people a way to feel that they are not simply living at kilometer marker such and such of riverbank, but along the calf, the shoulder, the hand of Osiris. The state does not argue with such an elegant solution. Bureaucrats are, if nothing else, appreciative of narratives that make their maps feel inevitable. Over generations, this quiet cartography seeps deeper. Pilgrims walk routes that they half know from bedtime stories. A boy leading his father's donkey to market in the north might be told, very offhand, that they have just crossed from the region of Osiris' chest into the region of his throat, and to mind their language accordingly. A woman bringing oil to a temple in the south may murmur that the goddess' strengthening leg is underfoot here, and feel steady as she climbs the steps. None of this requires dramatic belief. It is the sort of gentle overlay people place on landscapes all the time, like calling a particular intersection lucky because once, long ago, the rain stopped just as they reached it. In niches of libraries, scholars with tidy braids and stacks of scrolls occasionally mention the pattern in more serious tones. They speculate, with the slow satisfaction of people who enjoy footnotes, that Osiris' path of dismemberment and Isis, path of gathering, were remembered so carefully that the country unconsciously planned itself along them. Temples anchor gnomes, gnomes anchor loyalties. A body once cut apart becomes, through attention and ceremony, a spine that holds everything up. It is a very Egyptian outcome. Take an outrage, wrap it in linen, apply incense and annual festivals, and by the time you are done, it has become infrastructure. Late at night, when the official narratives have been carefully intoned and the last sistrum has gone quiet, those same scholars sometimes lean back and let themselves consider a softer possibility. Perhaps the story arose because the land was already crowded with sacred places, and people needed a single thread to tie them into a necklace. Perhaps Osiris pieces were mapped onto existing shrines instead of the other way around. Either way, the result is comforting. The kingdom is a body. The gods have nerves here, muscles there. To be buried in any acceptable spot along the Nile is to be folded into that ongoing anatomy. It simplifies the afterlife paperwork nicely. You are never too far from some reassuring part of Osiris. If you are still faintly awake, you can follow that thought like a boat lamp drifting downstream. Imagine standing at any point by the river, closing your eyes, and knowing that mythically, anatomically, ministerially, you are included. You do not have to remember which fragment lay where. The priests have done that for you, endlessly, in their litanies. Your task is only to be small and sincere, and placed somewhere along the god's long, reclining outline. As long as the Nile flows, the map holds. As long as the festivals repeat, the seams stay stitched. The story does not end, of course. It simply continues to circulate, as the water does, as rumors of relics do. New temples are built with an eye to how their foundations touch the invisible body. Old shrines insist gently that their claim has seniority. Cartographers draw pragmatic plans for canals and storage silos, but in their margins little symbols creep in: a crown, an eye, a crook, and flail. Children trace the root of Isis in the dust, not to scale, but convincingly enough. Travelers along the Nile fall into the same drowsy rhythm as the myth: chest, limb, bend, hill. City, shrine, mouth of the river. Somewhere behind it all, Osiris lies as he has been arranged, whole in story if not in fact, turning a cruel act into a long, quiet reassurance that every stretch of shore belongs, somehow, to a resurrected king. And so the narration itself, like the current, can wander from one bank to the other, naming towns, touching silt, repeating modest wonders without hurry. We can linger on the idea that a god's scattered bones became signposts, that grief walked the river and left waypoints for pilgrims and administrators alike, that a myth could be both a lament and a user-friendly navigation system. Eventually your thoughts start mapping their own gentle routes, looping from temple to temple, limb to limb, until they forget where the edges are. The Nile keeps flowing, Isis keeps walking, the pieces keep lying exactly where they need to lie. And somewhere in that endless, careful arrangement, your mind is invited to do the simplest, oldest thing, to follow the slow, predictable river of the story until it too becomes part of the landscape. Quiet and continuous going on, whether your eyes are open or already slipping closed. You might not expect a missing body to double as a national map, but in Egypt, even misfortune was given a job description, and Osiris's scattered limbs ended up working in cartography. Picture the Nile after dark, a quiet black ribbon, temples dimmed, fishermen folding their nets, and somewhere upstream a single wooden chest drifting in a very dignified, very lost sort of way. No storm, no thunder, only the soft logic of current against cedar. The chest that closed on Osiris is heavy with gold and perfumes and unnecessary interior decoration. The sort of box that would arrive flat-packed with impossible instructions if it were sold now. When its lid slid into place, people said the river shifted key, as if the country had received a sealed royal memo and was politely pretending not to read it yet. The chest glides along sandbanks and reeds, past dozing crocodiles who are professionally interested in cargo, yet oddly respectful of divine packaging. No one opens it. In Egypt, if you find a mysterious box floating past at midnight, you assume at minimum a priest owns it and at maximum a god. So you nod, you pour a small libation in its general direction, and you let it continue. But you remember the place where you saw it. People are good at that. The first village says it passed by here. The next one says, no, here. Already a thin dotted line is drawing itself along the riverbank, and no one has had to sharpen a reed pen. In later retellings, the chest arrives in a foreign marsh thick with papyrus, because even myths enjoy an international episode. A tree wraps itself around the box, growing up and over and politely pretending this is all an avant-garde core of sacred wood. A palace is built using that timber. A pillar smells faintly of incense and unresolved narrative. Again, the story could be loud, but we follow the quiet details. Careful carpenters, measurements checked twice, chalk dust on sandals, a column that people touch without knowing why it hums like a closed hymn. The important thing is the habit forming beneath the story. The place where the coffin grounded becomes a holy there on everyone's inner map. A mental pin. Someday pilgrims will come. For now, a shepherd cutting reeds simply notes that the air here feels slightly crowded, as if an invisible crowd is standing very politely in line. Then Seth, devoted to the principle that if something can be made inconvenient, it should be, rearranges Osiris into many pieces. Other versions enjoy the dramatic banquet. Our version sighs and keeps its voice low. The dismemberment is not a frenzy. It is administration. Limbs placed in jars, sealed like misaddressed shipments, each one drifting away or buried with the kind of bad-tempered precision that belongs frankly, in an office. Imagine an immortal clerk stamping forms, one right arm dispatched to Lower Egypt. Signature, please. The result is a country seated with quiet catastrophes. A bend of river inherits a hand. A rocky outcrop receives a rib. A delta marsh receives something we will not specify before sleep. Seth thinks he has dissolved the king. What he has actually done is annotate the landscape with a set of sacred footnotes no one will ever entirely erase. In temples the lamps burn late as priests hear rumors. Word of scattered pieces arrives folded into gossip, into trade routes, into letters that never write the whole thing down but still give enough clues. At Thebes, someone murmurs that a foot is not far from their western cliffs. At Pei and Dep, there is talk of a sacred spine. These are not official bulletins, just the warm murmur of "we heard," drifting over beer jars. Yet every whisper tucks a little more story into a location. The idea that holiness might be hidden in your backyard fig tree is unexpectedly comforting. It is also, as later administrators will quietly appreciate, excellent for encouraging local engagement. Villages straighten their shrines as if a divine inspector might drop by to check for limbs. Sometime after this tidy scattering, Isis begins to walk. She walks by night because grief prefers the cool. Also because stars make better company than witnesses. Along the Nile's edge, her lamp swings like a slow metronome, ticking out the rhythm of a search that has nowhere urgent to be. We are not in a hurry. Her sandals leave faint prints in silt that will be gone by morning, but what matters is where she pauses. At a low hill where sycamores lean in a certain thoughtful way, she listens and decides, yes, this is a place where a chest might have been pulled ashore. Someone will build a shrine here later. At a bend in the river that curves like a sleeping elbow, she lingers and is sure a part of Osiris touched this bank. The pause becomes a mark. The mark becomes a reason to return each year with incense and a festival schedule. Everywhere Isis stops, the landscape collects adjectives. A village is no longer just the one with decent lentils, but also where her tears fell in the dust. A patch of desert takes on the reputation of where he lay in silence a little while. In a surprisingly short mythic time frame, Egypt is threaded with such associations, each one a bead on her route. People begin to repeat them to children, because nothing settles geography in a young mind like a story involving divine relatives. Grandmothers stir porridge and say, "Your uncle's boatyard stands near the sacred shoulder. Mind you sweep it properly." The river becomes not merely north and south, but a narrative spine. This is where the goddess rested. This is where she spoke his name. This is where something hidden forgave the world a little. When she finds a piece, she does not gasp or lift it to the lightning. We are still whispering here. She lifts it as if it is a sleeping child, wraps it in linen, and labels it with spells, which are essentially very dedicated address tags. Each recovered limb is placed in what will be the nearest, kindest shrine. The reassembly is more like careful archiving than surgery. If you imagine a hall of records where each cabinet contains one restored moment of Osiris, you are not far off. Piece by piece, her work makes the country feel stitched instead of shattered. You live here, people think near the shoulder. You trade grain there, near the ankle. You take ferries over by the heart. It is all very anatomical and somehow very cozy, as if the whole country were tucking itself into one large linen wrap for security. Cities notice, because cities always notice when pilgrims start arriving with baskets. Abydos, Osiris, Mendes, each with their own mythic credentials, begin to align themselves with particular fragments. The statements are diplomatic and confident. Of course, all Egypt is Osiris, one temple scribe writes, but naturally the most true form is honored here. Another counters with equal politeness that their town holds the place where the secret was completed, which is vague but sounds authoritative on papyrus. None of them loudly deny one another. Open contradiction invites divine audits. Instead, each community polishes its claim the way one polishes a festival bark, regularly and in public, with more incense than is strictly necessary. Soon tombs of kings sprout and double. A royal might have his actual burial tucked deep in the western cliffs, and a symbolic tomb at Abydos, like owning both a quiet apartment and a prestigious mailing address. The cenotaphs stand as stone stand-ins, ensuring that no matter which specific gate of the underworld the soul chooses, mail can be forwarded correctly. Workers who carve these secondary chambers know they're chiseling their names into the soft outline of the god. It is an oddly pleasant form of spiritual real estate with excellent views of eternity. The rivalry between cult centers never quite becomes a fight. It is more like an ongoing, pious version of debating whose bakery makes the bread the gods prefer. Each shrine refines its rituals, its calendar, its processions, all to match how it imagines Osiris lies within its grounds. At Mendes, the ceremonies emphasize breath and voice. At Osiris, they underline the spine and steadfastness. At Abydos, great processions trace long ovals in the desert, sketching rib cages in sand. Regional politics folds itself neatly inside this religious language. To be loyal to your gnome's claimed body part is to be loyal to your gnome. You support your local sacred vertebra the way some people now support a local team with slightly unreasonable enthusiasm and themed items on festival days. Across generations, priests and scribes begin to realize that these devotions resemble coordinates. They are not rushing to publish this observation. Instead, they test it quietly in the margins of scrolls. Lists of shrines appear in sequences that follow the Nile like a patient finger. Festival itineraries move from site to site in what looks suspiciously like an organized survey. When the sacred bark of Osiris travels during mysteries, it stops in an order that, if traced, would draw a rather recognizable silhouette. Geography and theology have entered into one of those long-term committed relationships where they share storage and forget which votive bowls belong to whom. Calendars join in. A certain month is when the chest drifted. Another marks the search. Another carries the memory of assembling. Each is linked to particular stretches of river. People can tell you, this is the season of the Delta search, when the winds from the north are strong, and it is suitable to remember. Market days and tax days quietly align themselves to these rhythms, because if you must collect grain, it is wise to do so when people already feel religiously cooperative. In the end, Osiris's itinerary is printed not only across stone, but into the bureaucracy. A scribe filling out a receipt in red ink is repeating patterns set by a floating coffin. The hidden atlas does not require parchment. It exists in footsteps, in procession routes, and where you naturally turn your head when someone says his heart, his head, his spine. Still, there are human attempts to tidy it into diagrams. One priest suggests that when the chest first drifted, it taught people to pay attention to where sacred events touched the bank, and everything followed from that. Another counters in his patient commentary that the shrines came first, and Osiris was layered over them later like a translucent grid, because the gods appreciate efficient use of existing infrastructure. The debate is charmingly unresolved, like scholars arguing at a whisper over which side of the bread honors which deity, all while continuing to eat. For sleepy purposes, you can let both possibilities exist. Either a murder became a map, or a map recruited a murder. In either case, the outcome is this. If you stand anywhere along the Nile and look around, someone can tell you which part of Osiris you are nearest. They might say you are close to the place of his backbone, so stand straight. Or you are by the curve of his arm, so be generous. Or, in some very optimistic towns, you are obviously by the crowned head. None of this needs to be enforced with thunder. It is enforced by habit, story, and the pleasing human desire to know exactly where one is on the great invisible diagram. If you are still awake in this very quiet moment, You can subscribe your thoughts to this notion as unobtrusively as sliding a shabti into a corner niche. You do not have to click anything. Just decide in the soft bureaucracy of your own mind that for tonight your bed is somewhere on that map. Perhaps you are resting near the calm of his rebuilt heart, or out by the contemplative beam where travelers pause, or near the outstretched hand that welcomes boats home. It is an optional feature the Nile will not check, but the idea tends to make the walls feel less separate from desert and sky, as though your room is just another painted chamber in a much larger tomb of stars and silt. Outside that imagined room, Egypt goes on tracing and retracing its sacred geography. Boats move in their set channels, following currents older than memory. Even the night ferryman who thinks only of his rope is unwittingly redrawing the same lines Isis walked. Processions wind along roads that remember sandals from dynasties ago. Priests in white linen strike small metal instruments whose sounds mark the quarters of the night like delicate compass points. In cereal fields, dawn breezes comb barley in slow waves remarkably similar to the carved lines on temple walls. Scribes sharpen their reed pens and drag ink across papyrus in strokes that run parallel to the river. Small dark tributaries feeding the same story. Nothing in this arrangement requires urgency. Seth, who tried to shatter, is reduced here to an early step in a long administrative process. Isis, who gathered, becomes the patron of careful follow-through and long walks. The people who might have been frightened by a god in pieces take comfort that every piece has a place in every place of festival. To live anywhere in the two lands is to be able to say, if we walk out at dawn and listen, we will hear which part of the body this is. It may only be a whisper in the reeds, but that is enough. For storytellers, it is a gift with no natural ending. You can always name one more shrine, one more curve of river, one more town where someone says, here he touched, or here she found him, or here we light a lamp just in case. You can add them slowly, until the recitation sounds like thin rain against stone. So the tale of the dismembered king settles into exactly the sort of story that moves at the speed of sleep. Repetitive, precise, almost pointlessly detailed, and therefore soothing. It invites your own thoughts to wander like Isis along the dark bank, lantern in hand, not searching frantically, but pausing wherever something feels right, marking the comfortable spots. Perhaps you follow the river down to the many-fingered delta. Perhaps you turn upstream toward the cataracts, where the water thickens and the map grows quiet and rocky. Perhaps you do not get that far. Somewhere along the invisible outline of Osiris, between one shrine and the next, the words thin out into breath, and the country of the story keeps stretching north and south without needing to arrive anywhere at all, while you drift gently off its banks into your own unhurried night. You might not expect a dismembered god to double as a national navigation system, but along the Nile, even grief was organized enough to be useful. The story begins without thunder, without racing chariots, only with a cedar chest pushed into the current as quietly as someone closing the lid on a long day. The wood is expensive, inlaid with gold and intention, which in normal circumstances would make it the focus of cheerful palace gossip. Now it floats like a sealed sentence, carried by the river that always minds its own business while remembering everything. Villagers on the banks watch it slip past in the fading light. No one runs after it. In Egypt, if you see a mysterious gilded box drifting downstream, the etiquette manual strongly recommends respectful staring, plus a small offering if available. Someone places a jug of cool water on a rock, just in case the traveler inside is thirsty. Someone else notes the spot mentally, tucking it into that inner map where the tamarisk tree with the Huron and the bend where Aunt So-and-so fell out of the boat already live. None of them knows that later storytellers will mark this, exactly here, as a coordinate in a sacred atlas built out of one god's misfortune. They are only being polite and precise, the way farmers and boatmen always are when it comes to what passed which bank and when. The chest does not shout. It proceeds at the speed of the Nile in its thoughtful mood, touching against reeds, pausing under branches, letting fish examine its corners. Somewhere a crocodile surfaces, gives it a professional once-over, and decides that, paperwork-wise, this is above his station. The lid never moves. Inside lies Osiris, once king, now sleeper, wrapped in linen that smells of resin and rulership. When the chest grounds at last in a marsh where papyrus grows so thick the air hums green, its stillness teaches that place a new word. People say this is where something heavy came to rest. They build a pillar later from the tree that grew around it. The pillar hums faintly with perfume, like a secret trying not to be a secret. Courts walk past it daily, fanning themselves, unaware that their architectural centerpiece contains a closed story. Yet again, the map gains a mark. Here, it notes in silence, here the chest was absorbed. It is not dramatic. It is how most important locations start, with something interesting happening, and no one quite dealing with it at the time. When Seth chooses to cut the body, the tale presents it as horror. But if you listen closely, you can hear the shuffle of administration behind it. Each piece is wrapped, labeled in muttered curses that accidentally serve as catalog numbers, and discarded with method. They go into the river, into fields, into desert edges, scattered not like random debris, but like a surveyor's pegs. Head here, heart there, spine elsewhere, an odd rib tucked into a quiet cove that will now have to be reverent about it forever. You can almost imagine Seth leaning over a rough sketch of Egypt, tapping the places where he means to deposit each fragment, thinking there that should complicate commemorative practices. With the satisfaction of someone arranging a very petty board game. It is gruesome, yes, but it is also exact, and that exactness refuses to vanish. People remember where a strange story claims something sank or was buried or burned. Farmers point with their hoes and say, "The old man told us a part of him lay there." Children kick dust over the rumor and then grow up and build shrines on the same spots, none of this rushed. All of it guided by the human inability to forget a well-placed detail dot, so a god's ruined body becomes a quiet grid overlaying the valley. It is not yet written in ink. It passes mouth to ear, palm to palm, along trading boats and at beer jars. Temple scribes hear whispers and file them away like unsanctioned but intriguing memos. Somewhere, a scroll starts that just says, "Concerning the several resting places of the Lord of the West," and then stops because dinner is ready. No one has a full list, but many have fragments of fragments. Over time, those fragments add up, the way every household knowing one step of a dance can. At festivals, produce an entire choreography without anyone being quite sure who rehearsed it. The Nile listens, nods, and continues to carry all these coordinates in its patient current. Into this landscape walks Isis, not in a rush, because eternity allows for a very careful search pattern. She goes by night when the air over the water cools to a dark blue sky and the crocodiles are sleepy and philosophical. Her lamp throws a limited circle, so she learns the banks in exquisite detail, the exact angle of a root, the way certain rocks pretend to be crocodiles and certain crocodiles pretend to be rocks, where reeds squeak and where they murmur. As she moves, the story moves with her. The tale never forgets to call her great of magic and devoted of heart, but it is more interested in the small choices. She listens, she names, she remembers. At a certain village, she pauses. There is a slope that feels right, a whisper of presence in the dust. And so later the villagers will say, "Here she found part of him," whether the inscriptions agree or not. It helps trade, of course. Pilgrims are thirsty, pious, and generous tippers. But underneath the economics, there is real tenderness. To host even an imagined fragment of Osiris is to feel woven into a long, slow kindness. Asterisk. She moves along sandbars and ferry crossings. Each time she stops long enough to rest her feet or retrim the lamp's wick, that stop gains weight. This, people say, is where Isis sat. They do not say it loudly. It is the sort of fact you drop into conversation while shelling peas. And so the map gains its second layer, not only the coordinates of what was done to Osiris, but the patient dotted line of where Isis walked to undo it. Even if you never see her, when you stand in those places at night, you might feel that the darkness is slightly more awake, as if expecting a woman with a lamp. It is the kind of expectation that makes people build chapels. Purely so, the feeling has appropriate accommodation. A low doorway, a polished stone, a niche for oil and flame, all because once upon a time someone thought she might have passed this way when she retrieves a piece. She does not hoist it into the sky or issue a press release. She treats it the way archivists treat rare papyri, gently with labeling. She wraps it in fresh linen, adds a spell or three, and arranges for it to rest where hands and incense can reach. Each fragment becomes the heart of a ritual, and every ritual is also a tiny accent mark above a locality on the unfolding map. The torso means a processional route circling fields. The head demands a perpetual flame and an extra tidy forecourt. The spine requires pillars in dignified rows. The more Isis gathers, the more Egypt's sacred geography thickens. Like ink lines gone over so many times, they become a low relief on the page. Unity of the kingdom is rehearsed as unity of the body, and no one minds that this is slightly literal. A land that spends part of every year waiting for the river to reassemble itself out of floodwater is perfectly comfortable with the idea that wholeness is a seasonal, ritualized achievement. Other gods watch this cartographic devotion with interest. Thoth, patron of writing, makes notes in tight, elegant hands no one but he can read, which is fine because he can read everyone else. Nephthys provides logistical support, the unsung heroine of myth, quietly ensuring offerings arrive on schedule and torches do not go out at awkward symbolic moments. Even Anubis, who specializes in what happens after everything, road tests some of these routes, padding along them in jockle form to see whether they feel suitable for future funerary traffic. But it is humans who elaborate the system with the enthusiasm of people who have discovered spiritual tourism. If your town is near a rumored limb, you host a festival. If you lack a limb, you borrow symbolic importance, perhaps Isis passed by, or a boat carrying a fragment tied up at your dock for exactly one extremely significant night. The claim does not need to be watertight. It only needs to be repeated with serene confidence and supported by snacks. In time, certain cities rise as principal claimants. Abydos speaks first, or at least loudest, proposing itself as the truest resting place of Osiris's mystery. Its priests compose hymns that describe processions out into the desert, mimicking the god's journey. Kings, recognizing a well-organized cult when they see one, build mighty tombs there, some filled with their actual mummies, others serving as symbolic second homes in case eternity needs options. Elsewhere, Osiris and Mendes refine their own narratives, each politely insisting they hold the essential piece. On the surface, it sounds contradictory. In practice, it is remarkably peaceful. The holy equivalent of several bakeries, all claiming to make the original recipe loaf. While everyone continues to eat bread, contentedly dot, these local competitions carve their own marks into the map. Dikes and causeways orient toward favored shrines. Roads learn to bend just enough to incorporate a holy courtyard. You go to market passing through the shadow of your known's portion of Osiris, and this subtly improves your mood. Builders take care that sightlines from certain doorways catch specific tombs, in case the dead are watching and appreciate a good view. Double burials appear, one grave where the king physically rests, another where his name sleeps among peers in Abydos, ready to join the ongoing passion play. Stone by stone, the valley becomes layered with options for where the royal soul might emerge. Like a well-designed railway network with interchangeable termini and a very patient timetable, beneath the theology, a soft practicality is at work. If every region can claim intimacy with the God who guarantees regeneration, every region has a reason to stay inside the same mythic conversation. Rebellion becomes awkward when your main festival depends on actors from 3 neighboring gnomes and the loan of a sacred bow. Loyalty is expressed by keeping up the rituals, repairing the causeway, polishing the statues' noses. It is national infrastructure disguised as piety, or piety disguised as infrastructure. After a while, the difference gently dissolves. In the silence after the hymns, you can almost hear the country agreeing with itself. All of this would remain scattered impressions if not for the scribes, who hate loose ends almost as much as they love neat columns. Quietly, in festival lists and temple walls, they begin to arrange the Osiris places in meaningful orders. A hymn names shrines from south to north. A ritual text sends a torch from one city to another in a glowing chain. Follow enough of these and you realize they trace the river with a devotion that would make any modern cartographer nod appreciatively before going back to their much less poetic spreadsheets. The myth of the dismembered king and the practical need to describe where things are meet in the middle and shake hands. That is what the last soft turn of the story concerns itself with, reading this hidden atlas without rushing, like turning pages of a very old book while half asleep. You start to notice that certain festivals cluster along the Nile like lanterns on an invisible outline of Osiris's form. You notice that stories ensure every strategically important harbor, junction, and fertile stretch has a connection, however creative, to his body. It is as though the land, prone to annual flooding and shifting boundaries, has chosen myth as its way of saying, these points do not move, even when everything else looks like water. Where the river bends, there is a shrine. Where caravans cross, there is a hill with a story. Where a canal begins, someone once murmured that here a sacred finger touched. Coordinates by anecdote, contours by memory. The priests would never call it a map. They speak of mysteries and processions, not of route planning. Nevertheless, when farmers calculate when to cut the barley, when tax collectors schedule their journeys, when boat captains memorize safe banks and risky sandbars, they are unconsciously consulting the same mental grid formed by these repetitions. Osiris has become the pattern behind the practicalities. He is not only lord of the afterlife, but patron of this is the correct bend of river. We know because the drama stops here every year to light torches. For you, listening in the dark, this network of sacred points can become an easy exercise for a drowsy mind. Imagine yourself on a small boat, the gentle kind with a single square sail and no particular deadline. You drift from shrine to shrine, announced only by the soft knock of wood on keystones. At one stop, they say, the chest floated past. At another, a rib was honored. At another, Isis was certain enough about a footprint to leave a chapel. No one presses you to disembark. You may stay under your woven canopy, counting lamps as they blur. The river knows the order. You do not have to. Your only task is to acknowledge, in a very relaxed fashion, that each place exists and glows for its own reasons. Like small bookmarks in a book you're happy never to finish. If you happen to still be awake, you might notice the faintly amusing efficiency of it all. A tragic myth becoming the backbone of long-distance pilgrimage. Local politics solved with altars instead of arguments. The country learning itself body part by body part until even a sleepy donkey driver can tell you which gnome corresponds to which invisible anatomy. It is bureaucracy raised to the level of poetry, or poetry raised to the level of making sure everyone sails on the same side of a sandbank. And if you do drift off mid-sentence while the litany of sanctuaries continues, That is perfectly in keeping with Egyptian style. Many of their texts also end abruptly when the available stone runs out, as if the scribe simply yawned and decided eternity would understand. Eventually, the narration thins into quiet reminders that wherever Osiris was said to rest, a lamp was lit, that wherever Isis walked, someone remembered the sound of her sandals on packed earth, that the scattered pieces were not left only as symbols of harm, but were repurposed into landmarks, like gentled scars showing where the story has healed. You can float along that idea as long as you like. There is no dramatic final revelation, just more river, more shrines, more stars leaning over to see where the next quiet offering will be placed. The atlas of the gods stays open, the pages turning lightly in the night breeze, while your own thoughts unfasten one by one, like well-tied knots finally, contentedly coming loose. You might not expect a nation to find its way home using the quietly misplaced pieces of a god, but Egypt had a talent for turning even awkward celestial incidents into practical guidance. Imagine the river at dusk, the air soft and slow, a lamp flickering on black water while someone, somewhere upstream, slides a beautifully crafted chest into the current with the hesitant care of a person returning a library book very late. The chest glides out, sealed and dignified, carrying Osiris not as a thunderclap of tragedy, but as a silent, heavy punctuation mark. Villagers see it pass and do what villagers always do with mysterious floating furniture. They look, they murmur, and they remember. One notes the exact place where the lid caught the last orange of the sunset. Another remembers how the current shifted around it, as if the Nile itself checked the address. People say, almost absently, that something important went by today. They tell the story at dinner, with bread and beer and a shrug, and without realizing it, they pin the first point on a mythic map. If you are still awake enough to collect coordinates, you can tuck this one away too, or let it drift. The river and I will keep track for you. Downstream, the chest pauses and reads, makes friends with the tree, and becomes part of a palace story. But here, for our sleep-soaked purposes, it is only a slow-moving landmark that teaches Egypt the pleasing habit of recalling precisely where unusual things touch the shore. When later storytellers confess that Osiris' body was divided, it is done with more intention than gore. Each piece is said to fall in a particular district, as neatly as if Seth, in a fit of unadvertised urban planning, had dropped markers across the two lands. Head here, heart there, spine comfortably elsewhere. The tale, told in lamplight, gives every region a whispered claim. We keep a secret right over that hill. These are not coordinates written in numbers, but in phrases like, by the tall sycamore, and where the herons do not mind people, the sort of directions that work better than maps when you live beside a river that bends as often as conversation. And so, while the official world hums along with taxes and harvests, a quieter geometry spreads, a sense that certain bends, certain mounds, certain unusually talkative trees are part of Osiris himself, and that walking the country is, in a way, walking through his gently scattered presence. Into this landscape of unmarked but thoroughly remembered points walks Isis, and she does it with the slow determination of someone who has accepted that the only way to solve a divine mystery is to literally walk the entire river like a very patient postal worker. At night she follows the current, her lamp throwing a small gold circle on the path, learning every root and ripple. The crocodiles, who know an important colleague when they see one, respectfully keep to the deeper channels. She stops where the air feels different, where reeds lean as if listening, and quietly says a name. Some places do not answer, others, according to the story, do. At each responsive shore, memory sticks like silt. In the mornings, when the first light makes the water pale and ordinary again, people recall that the goddess once stood just there, between the two flat stones. or rested beside that acacia whose shade is always slightly cooler than it has any business being. The myth insists she is searching for pieces, but from the drowsy viewpoint of your pillow, it also sounds like she is labeling the landscape for future reference. By retracing the river, Isis teaches everyone to think of Egypt as a path stitched together by lamplight and careful footsteps. When she gathers a fragment of Osiris, never with rush or spectacle, no heroic soundtrack, just linen and murmured words, she bandages it as if repairing both a body and a boundary stone. Here, where she worked, becomes a sanctuary. There, where she wept politely and did very delicate magic, becomes a festival stop. Piece by piece, the story has her reassembling him, but it also shows her reassembling the country, folding each gnome into the same gentle choreography: receive, honor, remember, pass it on. It's an oddly soothing procedure, like sorting a scattered deck back into order while talking softly to yourself. If in a few minutes you're still awake, you may of course subscribe to following this route in your imagination. If not, the goddess is quite capable of continuing without supervision. With time, naturally, the humans get involved in the way humans do when there is both holiness and regional pride at stake. Different cities begin to claim different parts of Osiris, story with the unhurried competitiveness of people decorating notice boards. Abydos announces itself as the true core, composing beautiful texts, staging processions into the desert that reenact the god's journey with more costumes and slightly better crowd control each year. Other places, Osiris, Mendes, the Spend, that mound clear their throats and suggest that their shrines are equally, if not more, crucial, since obviously the most sacred rib or spine, or particularly significant vertebra, is theirs. None of this becomes open conflict. Instead, it evolves into a calendar. Pilgrims and pharaohs travel from one definitive site to another, and the journey itself reinforces the sense of a single woven land. Inscriptions lean into this, dropping graceful hints. Here is where he rests, here is where he also rests, and here, intriguingly, is where he may rest in symbolic form with benefits. Kings start commissioning double arrangements with one tomb near their home and another cenotaph at Abydos, so their names can neatly appear in multiple performances of eternity. It is the metaphysical equivalent of forwarding your mail. The landscape fills with chapels that mirror one another, like respectful echoes, pylons set to face the right stars, courtyards opening toward the right stretch of river, doorways aligned so that if Osiris or the king, or an exceptionally organized ghost wanted to stroll from shrine to shrine, the sightlines would be clear. All the while, priests maintain a tone of calm certainty. Their texts glide over any contradictions with the serene flexibility of legal phrasing. The god is whole, they say, but generously present in many places for the convenience of worshippers. Behind that line, you can sense the cleverness. Allow every gnome a piece to tend, and they will polish that piece, and in doing so, polish their part of the shared mythology. It is soft diplomacy achieved through incense and festival boats, and it means that when people look at their local shrine, they see not just stone, but a stitch anchoring them into a much larger, very dignified tapestry dot eventually. This patient accumulation of stories, shrines, and processions becomes something so familiar that no one thinks to remark on how astonishingly organized it is. The Osiris myths function as a hushed atlas. Hymns list sanctuaries in geographic order, ostensibly praising his many manifestations, quietly teaching the route between gnomes. Rituals send symbolic limbs or tokens from south to north, north to south, like glowing markers tracing the current. A scribe copying the text for the 37th ton notices, perhaps with a private smile, that anyone following these instructions could sail the Nile without once asking for directions. This is myth as navigation app, running entirely on memory and moonlight. Farmers know when a procession will pass their fields. They time their chores so they can watch the torches snake along the levee, confirming once more that their patch is on the path. Boatmen know which landing belongs to which sacred claim. A misplaced barge load of festival furniture would be an embarrassment no one intends to risk. Over generations, children grow up reciting the sequence of holy places as easily as you might hum a tune you heard too often in shops. They may not frame it as geography, but when they close their eyes they can float, shrine by shrine, like beads along Osiris' invisible spine. You, listening now, can borrow that technique. Let your thoughts become a quiet boat, unhurried, slipping from Abydos to the next gentle harbor whose name you only half catch. At each stop, there is a low doorway, a cool floor, a small statue receiving bread and water, as if this were the most normal arrangement in the world, to feed a god so that he keeps the country stitched together and the seasons on schedule. No revelation interrupts this drift. The map does not suddenly fold or burst into flame. It simply continues calmly around each bend, confirming that there is always another lamp ahead, another story stone on the bank, another place where people have agreed, with great tenderness and a little local flair, that a piece of Osiris once rested here and therefore they will keep watch. In that endless, orderly, almost bureaucratically gentle circuit, there's nothing left for you to do but breathe with the river. Let the names soften into music, and whenever you like, let your own edges blur into sleep while the sacred atlas of Egypt keeps turning pages without needing you to stay awake to the end. You might not expect an entire kingdom to navigate itself by the misplaced pieces of a god, but along the Nile, directions were often given with more poetry than practicality. The story begins so quietly you might miss the crucial moment. In low light, in a polished hall that smells of resin and river air, a beautifully made chest is closed with the softest thud. It is not locked with rage or thunder. It simply clicks shut, the way a careful scribe closes a cosmetics box. Servants steady the lid, as if they are just making sure nothing chips. Outside, the river waits, pretending not to watch, like a patient neighbor who has seen every family argument since the Old Kingdom and knows this one will also end up as paperwork. The chest is carried out, borne on shoulders that do not hurry. Its gold inlay does not announce that a myth is being loaded onto the current. It only glints politely. When the chest is eased into the Nile, it does not splash. It nestles, sighs, and drifts off like someone who has decided to nap in the world's longest bed. People on the bank pause, of course. They always do when furniture floats past. A fisherman remembers the exact stand of papyrus it brushed. A child thinks here is where the weird box went by. No one knows they have just set the first pin in a sacred map. They go back to threading nets, to counting jars, to thinking about lunch. But the positions stick in their minds, small coordinates pinned by habit, not by orders. If you are somehow still awake later, you might mentally mark it too. If not, that is fine. The Nile has an excellent memory, and historically did not need your help, Dot, in the more elaborate versions of the tale. Seth's temper eventually does what dramatic relatives' tempers do. It takes a bad situation and turns it into several smaller, less manageable situations. Yet even this is recounted with curiously neat phrasing, as if the god of storms were following a checklist. The body of Osiris does not vanish in a blur. It becomes a set of destinations. The head associated with one gnome, the heart with another, a favored bone associated with a curve of hill that already looked like it was waiting for a story. Each fragment is less an atrocity than a label, like a carved tag discreetly tied to a crate, indicating that somewhere ahead someone will feel compelled to build a shrine there. Priests, when they repeat the myth, do not shout. They trace the route with their fingers on cool stone, murmuring place names, biblis in memory, a marsh by moonlight, a tamarisk whose trunk once held a secret. They turn cruelty into cartography because it is their job to turn unsettling events into schedules. In temple courtyards at dusk, old men recall that this bend in the river is blessed because once, in a story, an important limb may have paused here. Young scribes file the detail away the way you file away where you once left your keys. Not urgent now, useful later. It is not a horror tale. It is unintentionally a travel guide. Isis, hearing all this, begins the sort of project that would horrify anyone with a modern calendar app, but suits a goddess with eternity to spare. She decides to walk the river. She moves mostly at night, when the air is cool and the sounds are small. Her lamp grazes the ground in a narrow circle of honey-colored light. Wherever she stops, the myth pauses too. The reeds there remember the warmth of her ankles. A stone remembers that she rested her hand on it, however lightly. People say she searched in grief, and that is true. But she also surveyed with the precision of a land inspector who has read all the older contracts and found them vague. Every time she feels the faint tug of Osiris' presence, she marks the spot, not with signs you could trip over, but with the kind of attention that makes a place impossible to forget. Sometimes the stories say she transforms, hides, becomes a bird, a beggar, a breath of wind against the shutters. That is one way of describing the way memory works. You do not always notice it arriving. You notice later that you know the way. Dawn after dawn, she steps back onto the bank, leaving the night's subtle corrections behind her. When villagers wake and fetch water, they sense that their landing has become slightly more important overnight, though the ferry is still the same wobbly plank. They add an extra libation to the household shrine just in case. They say, "We heard she passed this way." This is how you turn a shoreline into a story without raising your voice at each successful discovery. Isis gathers a piece as though she is working a quiet craft. The myth loves to say as she reassembles him, bandage by bandage, as if working an intricate household chore that just happens to involve a god. There's no clamor, only linen, spells, small tools. She does not rush. Eternity dislikes haste. If you have ever tried to untangle a delicate necklace chain very late at night, with half your attention drifting, you understand the pace. The important point from the country's perspective is that every recovered part comes with a location, and every location becomes a focus for affection. Shrines rise, first as little mounds, then as chapels, then as complexes with lists, storerooms, and staff meetings. Each announces in stone, in slightly different wording, that here, at this precise patch of ground, the story touched earth. People travel. They bring bread, beer, maybe a question about their barley, maybe a hope their son will get a clerical job not too far from the river breeze. They return home saying, "I have been to the place where the shoulder is," or where the sacred trunk once rested, or where the sacred tree grew that once held the chest. Their neighbors nod as if this is normal, and cheerfully plan their own journeys. As with all good travel trends, it becomes self-sustaining. All the while, the priest, those caretakers of both narrative and timetable, are quietly delighted. They have, in the Osiris cycle, a myth that doubles as a national index. In temple schools, apprentice scribes copy lists of sanctuaries where the god is worshipped as this or as that, and as they do, they accidentally memorize the backbone of Egypt. The sequence of names drapes down the papyrus like a route description, a processional hymn that appears to be pure praise, O Osiris, Lord of Abydos, mighty in this place, gracious in that place, also works as a mnemonic for boat captains who have to remember the order of stops. Knowledge is embedded sideways, like a treasure slid under a mat. Festival calendars make use of it. On this day, a symbolic procession of Osiris emblem travels from one site to another. On that night, a light is set afloat to recall the roaming chest. The actions are small and repeatable. ideal for a culture that enjoys continuity as much as divinity. From your sleepy perspective, it is a bit like a recurring reminder list that never expires. Water the fields, pay the taxes, honor the god at the correct bend in the river. Miraculously, no one has to explain the system in a manual. It is sung, worn, walked thought over centuries, the accumulation of shrines, stories, and timetables becomes so normal that Egyptians may not have thought of it as a design map at all. In the same way that you may not think of your commute as an architectural masterpiece, yet there it is. The scattered body myth ensures that every region can say, very calmly, we look after him here, and that statement in turn encouraged them to look after each other. Pilgrims need safe roads. Processions need harbors. Priests exchanging festival letters must know when the flood is likely to delay a convoy of sacred barks. The gods' patient reassembly demands cooperation, and cooperation has a soothing rhythm. You can almost hear it in the night air, drums not of battle but of procession, steps not of armies but of choruses moving together at the exact speed of a lullaby. Matt, the principal of order, likes this very much. She does not need fanfare. She needs everyone to agree on what time the lamps are lit. Seen from a very late hour, from the point where your eyes are heavy and your thoughts start to wander sideways. Osiris' story looks less like a tragedy and more like an administrative success wrapped in incense. A violent act is recycled into a careful network of remembrance. Each limb becomes a landmark, yes, but also a responsibility. Each shrine becomes a promise that someone will keep an eye on that stretch of riverbank, that crossroads, that low desert ridge. Imagine floating downstream, not as a chess, thankfully, but as a featherlight observer. On one shore, a modest chapel where a single priest snoozes upright beside an oil lamp, waking every so often to murmur a line from a litany that has become muscle memory. On another, a larger complex where scribes quietly compare lists, making sure that the offering sent from the north arrived correctly in the south. Further on, a lay stone stele half swallowed by sand, still bearing a carved eye that watches the horizon with unbothered patience. The wind moves through reeds. An owl considers its schedule. Ra's boat slips under the stars exactly on time as it tends to. Cosmic transport is rarely delayed in Egyptian thought, and glances down approvingly at the ordered chain of lights. If the story had an ending, it would probably spoil the mood. Fortunately, it refuses. Osiris remains in the duet, evergreen and employed. Isis continues to be the kind of person who would cross a country on foot for someone she loves, which is reassuring if you have ever misplaced anything more important than keys. Shrines continue their slow maintenance of lamps and ledgers. The Nile rises and falls, each flood carefully measured at nilometers where priests record numbers that look like incantations but are also very simply data. The map of the gods' resting places is never finalized. New readings, new chapels, new quiet claims slip in without fuss. You lie there, listening to this endless, softly bureaucratic devotion, and understand that in such a world, nothing vanishes without leaving at least one tiny mark on the shoreline. Even if your thoughts drift away mid-sentence, the myth will go on circulating, connecting one stone to another in a chain of unhurried reverence. You are allowed to let go before it circles back to the beginning. The river remembers the route. The priests have it copied. Isis has walked it. Osiris is everywhere in particular. The lamps are tended. The map unfolds and unfolds and unfolds, tracing itself quietly in the dark, long after your own night has folded into sleep. You might not expect the moon to have an accountant, but Egypt, with its tidy affection for schedules, quietly assigned the job to Thoth. He works at night, which suits his ibis head and fondness for lamplight. His desk is a low table of polished wood, worn thin in the middle from centuries of elbows. Beside the table sits a jar with a lid that sighs when opened, because even jars breathe a little in a hot room. The ink is black as date stones, and the palette has two neat wells, one for black, one for red, because important notes deserve their own color. Each month he balances the numbers of days the way a baker counts loaves, tapping gently so the totals settle. The moon is not a difficult client, only temperamental, regularly deciding to appear less than promised and then more, as if trying on silhouettes. Thoth does not mind. He measures the light like water poured into a bowl and writes the figure down. When the figure will not add up to a perfect year, he adds the small and famous 5, the epigomenal days, those extra pieces that keep the holidays snug with the flood, the harvest, the good sleep of fields. He does this without ceremony, as if adjusting pillows so that time lies straight. If you're still awake later and want to keep me company as I count with him, you can, though you may also drift off and leave me writing. Thoth will not be offended. He has everything backed up on PAPYRUS. It is not that the night is silent. The temple walls faintly tick as they breathe the cool after the heat, and a water clock somewhere in a side room clips with a shy regularity. A priest dozes beside it with a string tied to his wrist, a device of his own design that yanks him awake whenever the bowl is almost full. Overhead, the deacons the star groups use to tell the hours rise with such discipline that you suspect they have rehearsed for centuries, which in fact they have. A cat walks the ledge and pretends it was part of the ritual, tail held like a small banner. Thoth lets the little sounds thread through his concentration and smiles at the professionalism of the stars. He draws a slim line to mark the night hour and lifts the pen to blow on it, careful not to smudge with his beak. A boring detail, but gods love boring details. They are the hinges that make the heavy doors of myth behave. The month's first day is labeled in balanced signs, and in the margin he writes a kindness. Remember to count the flood meanders, not the ox bellows. A note to younger scribes who learned on village calendars that use metaphors too robust for delicate numbers. If you dream around now, you might hear the sound of a reed nib being trimmed against a shell, a thin whisper that says the world is continuing to keep clean accounts. A thoughtful pause arrives whenever Thoth adds red ink. Red is for warning and enchantment, and the sort of small joke Egyptians adored. For instance, on the line for the 5th epigomenal day, he writes, with dignified understatement, a good day for cake and the judicious avoidance of rash promises, because everyone remembers what happens when too many oaths are made after celebratory beer. This is not gossip. It is public health. He writes the names of the births that are said to belong to those days: Osiris, Horus of Letopolis, Seth, Isis, Nephthys recorded, not to provoke them but to honor the paperwork of existence. Names require careful shelving. Thoth is the librarian of breath. If a magician asks for a true name, Thoth verifies with 3 seals and a raised eyebrow that says, "Are you certain?" He does this slowly to give people time to reconsider. He finds, as any night clerk could tell you, that half the emergencies in the world can be solved by a pause long enough to dissolve into a yawn dot in comfortable cities. Scribes echo him without knowing it. They sit on stoops in the stadiest shade and copy letters onto Astraka, the handy limestone offcuts that function as the ancient world's sticky notes writing, to a cousin upriver about the price of barley, or to a soldier in the east about a grandmother who insists her cat understands both offerings and calendars. The letters are exact in their little necessities. Send the comb I left on the festival barge. Remember the sandals with the cord that does not bite. Tell the carpenter to make the door a finger width taller because the new boy keeps bumping his tray. Thoth approves of this because his grand, slow book of the sky wants footnotes from the ground. He knows that a year is only as good as the list of who is expected to come home and when. He skims these communications the way a parent skims a child's stories, not for style, but for felt truth. Every now and then he adds a blessing in the margin, an eye sign here, a feather there, a small drawing of a jar that does not spill. If you wake and wonder whether the gods are reading your lists, the answer in Egypt is always yes. And they corrected your spelling very gently. Sometimes he leaves the accounting room and strolls to the water clock. He likes the sound of time as a liquid, tinny, and careful. The clock, shaped like a pot with lines inside, measures the hour by the steady loss of water. On evenings when the Nile's voice is louder than usual frogs practicing, reeds discussing the wind, he dips a finger to feel whether the drip has kept to pace. The priests used to mark the hours by star rising alone, but clouds exist and the river remembers drought, so a backup system is prudent. Thoth appreciates redundancy. He writes little calculations that convert star hours into water hours, and then to something a shepherd could use when deciding whether to turn the flock home. No one asked him to do this. He enjoys it. His pen draws a tidy table that has the humble ambition of all good tables, to be consulted and then ignored, because everything is comfortably predictable. Nearby, a worker oils the hinge of a cedar door that will not squeak in the next procession. The worker does not know that he has done theology. He only knows the hinge is pleased with him. In thus keeping, numbers are not stern. They are mild companions. He adds to them the feather of Maat, not to scold, but to balance. In the hall where hearts are weighed, his record keeping is present the way air is present, essential and invisible. He does not glare at the scales. He straightens the list so that the heart, wishing to be light, can rest on an honest line. There's an old remark he copies in every new scroll. A truth kept softly is heavier than a suspicion shouted, which is not official doctrine but feels useful in a room with jackal-headed inspectors. When a heart proves light enough, the feather nods, and Thoth notes the verdict in a square as neat as an amulet. When a heart is heavy, he does not add drama. He adds an asterisk that means see addendum, because he believes footnotes offer mercy to complicated lives. In this way, the afterlife resembles a very long review, meeting where the minutes are taken with unusual compassion dot by day. Thoth likes libraries no one has named as such. A scribe shirt hung to dry is a document about climate. The cutting of a reed pen reveals the geometry of angles. A jar of gum for mixing ink is a lesson in trees. He supervises without standing over anyone. If a young woman in leopard skin sashed the badge of a ritualist, tugs a cord to lay out a sacred building, Thoth watches the way she aligns the cord with the sight of the bright morning star, and he writes in the air, approved. Seshat, who is as serious about measurements as a cat is about door selection, joins him. Together they count the beats while the cord stretches, each nodding as if they can hear the wall growing. You might think architecture is a noisy enterprise, but the essential sounds are small, cord fiber sliding over a peg, chalk dust patting onto stone, breath held at a corner to see if it finally agrees with the ground. If the angles please them, the goddess plants her notched palm stem and makes that inexplainably satisfying mark that turns nowhere into somewhere. Thoth adds the place to his map of when, not just where. Places in Egypt are mostly calendars with addresses dot at certain hours when even priests relent and nap. Thoth opens the drawer of broken things. It contains pens that split, cords that frayed, a small pile of once smooth pebbles with letters half rubbed away by pockets. He enjoys mending. He smooths the pens with patient strokes until the reeds regain their calm. He ties the cords, leaves the knots visible as a kind of honest history, then rubs them with beeswax so they will not snag. He washes the pebbles in a bowl where yesterday's moon left a memory of itself and says, "You remember sentences, and the pebbles, being limestone, do not argue." Not everything needs to be repaired, of course. Some items are filed under use nobly. He keeps those too because evidence of wear is a happy kind of document. If you have a thought half-faded that you once meant to write and forgot, he places it in the drawer and marks it for rediscovery on a future epigomenal afternoon. This is the kind of divine courtesy that creates a feeling of providence when you suddenly remember something while standing by the sink. The streets, at night, oil themselves in coolness. A worker sweeps sand that wandered in from the desert as if sweeping time back where it belongs. In a doorway, an old musician with a lute of 3 strings plays a tune that seems, to the untrained ear, to have only one note, yet manages to remind the trained ear of several festivals at once. Thoth likes melodies like this because they behave like the calendar, repetitions with small, tender adjustments. Passing a bakery, he sees the tally marks on a wall, the morning count of loaves planned, crossed softly when done. A mathematics of breakfast. He acknowledges the tally as an altar of practicality and moves on. In the harbor, a night barge shifts against its ropes with that well-bred creak that boats have. When they spent the daylight being useful, the stars slide a tiny joint in the east. He notes it. He notes everything without hurrying, which is the ancient secret to noting anything at all. Toward the end of any long night, the ibis-headed clerk does something that seems like idleness but isn't. He leans his elbows on the sill and watches people sleep. Not intrusively, more like a shepherd checking the fence. The city is a quilt of roofs and courtyards, and on each square someone dreams the dream of their trade. The potter turns a silent wheel with one finger. The guard stamps his spear butt softly so as not to wake the spear. A child walks through a field where each stalk of barley says the child's name in a different key, and somehow, this is not frightening. Thoth considers adding this dream to the archive, but decides it belongs to the family. He contentedly records only the dew, which he files under temporary brightness. He has a system for such tiny things, of course. Systems are his lullabies. If I had the ambition of a famous storyteller, here I would deliver a conclusion, but Thoth prefers things without edges. He would rather the narration than into the hour before dawn, when birds make the reasonable suggestion that the day begin in a minute. Not now. He clips the reed pen, breathes upon the ink to rescue it from forming a cap, and places the palette on the shelf in the same careful spot it has occupied since a time when even history was a kitten. He checks the water clock, resets it with a satisfied nod, and sticks a slip of papyrus beside it that reads, "If late, forgive the river, because he is fair to the river." Outside, a priest on the roof counts the last of the decans by the comfortable names his father used, and a boy carrying new bread tries not to nibble his delivery and succeeds almost entirely. In the pale shade of a sycamore, Sachet lifts her measuring cord and smiles. The smile of someone who has found both the corner and the beginning hidden in the same piece of string. And in the room where the moon's accountant keeps night in order, the last mark of red dries to a soft brown, and the ledger looks like a well-baked loaf. Simple, worked, necessary. If you drift off now, your sleep will be entered in the registry as compliant with Matt, the feather's quiet tick beside your name. Time will continue to be polite in your absence. The moon will be counted. The epigomenal days will lurk at the end of the year like kind couches. And Thoth will still be there, a courteous clerk with an endless stack of papyrus, writing so gently that the sound, like the passing of a moth's wing, will carry you a little further down the river of night.